Who had grandparents fight in WW2 and what stories did they share? None at all. My grandpa went to Europe as a teenager, and it must have been messed up, because he never talked about his experience all the way up to his death. He came back with 3 medals and nobody in the family knows what he did to get them. Same. My grandfather was a Marine in the Pacific. Never wanted to talk about it. My dad said, when he asked his dad if he should sign up and go to Vietnam, grandpa said he'll know. Only go if they force you. Never knew my pappy was in Vietnam until a couple years ago, so I never asked him questions. Thought he kept it that way for some reason. Grandfather was a US sniper in the Pacific. One of the best stories was of a cocky officer who showed up and lined all the infantry up on the beach to tell them they were a bunch of pansies and he was going to whip them into shape. These men had been seeing hand-to-hand combat for months. The officer finally said, if there's a man on this beach that thinks he can whip my ass, take 1 step forward. Every man took a step forward immediately. The officer didn't say much after that. We had something like that happen after my first deployment. The whole company got together and we were able to call out anyone for a grappling match. One of our SSGs called out our company commander, who was possibly insane and was not entirely loved by the company. The co whipped the absolute shit out of the SSG lol. My paternal grandfather landed on Omaha on D-Day. That's it. That's all he ever shared. We know he spent the duration of the war in Europe, but whatever he saw or did was too much to ever tell my grandmother, dad, aunt or uncle. I think my granddad landed 2 or 3 days after D-Day and he never talked to me about it until a few months before his death. He recalled arriving on the beach and having to cross over the bodies of the fallen soldiers. It deeply affected him. Having him share just a few stories with me before he died this year felt like such an honor, as he never shared much with anyone about this time. Edit. For those curious, my granddad was a sergeant in the 554th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion. He also participated in the Battle of the Bulge and was awarded a Bronze Star for his service. Both my grandfathers served in the US Army Air Force. One was a waist gunner on a B-17. He caught some shrapnel from a German AA Gun 1 mission and almost bled out on the return trip. While he was in the hospital his plane was shot down. The other was an MP who would tell us about busting heads in bars. My grandfather was a flight engineer / top turret gunner on the B-17. He was very tight-lipped about his service. I joined the army after he had passed, and my aunt gave me an album of pictures from his time in Europe. It was pretty eye-opening to his experiences. My granddad was in WW2 in a tank destroyer unit. He never talked about it, but when I got back from a trip to Paris in high school he asked if it was still all blowed up over there, and said the last time he was there it was a big old mess. That's funny your granddad asked if it's still a mess. My grandpa used to give my dad shit because my dad got sent to Germany in '69. When my grandpa was there everything was bombed to shit. He would say my pops had it made because the base had roofs by the time my dad got there. My grandpa on my dad's side was 17 at the time and lied about his age to get into the Navy. He played saxophone in the Navy band aboard ships in the Pacific. I don't think he ever saw action, though, aside from that 6-axe action of course. My grandfather was in the resistance in Holland. He never spoke about the war to his wife, children, or grandchildren. If asked to relate stories he'd reply, I will not be responsible for the nightmares of another, would turn his hearing aid off, and nap in his chair. My opa never spoke of the war either. He was sent to the work camps. He returned once somehow on foot, but was sent back. Oma didn't speak of the war, but right up to her death in 1990s, she would spit if she saw a German. My uncles only remembered the starvation, and that they mustn't talk. They were too young for anything else to stick. My Austrian grandfather was drafted into the Wehrmacht and his unit was integrated into the SS in 1944. He was wounded in January 45 in the Battle of the Bulge whilst carrying out an attack on a US position. He got patched up by the Americans whilst the German officer wrote a letter home that he was missing in action. He still has the original letter. He was a prisoner of war in France from then on and had to stay until 46 or 47 as he was captured as a member of the SS and they were held longer than regular Wehrmacht soldiers. He still holds a grudge against the Nazis for stealing his youth and still has some shell or bullet fragments in his chest as far as I know. Cheers to the Americans for saving him. Grandfather was in an amphibious division in the Pacific Theater. He left us with little snippets of his time. A camp was pitch black because they didn't want to be visible from above. A guy in his cabin went to the outhouse and sat down to do his business when he heard something. He pulled his lighter out and lit it. A python was dangling down staring him in the face. He and another man were walking on a beach and the other guy just got shot through the head from a sniper. That sniper's decision led to my existence. General MacArthur showed up and gave him a promotion along with a few others. They took a video of MacArthur shaking the hands of a line of soldiers and used it for a pro-American propaganda film to be played before movies in the US. My grandma saw it and freaked the F out, and the theater owners gave her a copy of the photo. My grandpa was in the army. He never spoke about his service, but he was shot in the ankle and captured. He spent years in a VA hospital once he returned to the States. I heard second-hand stories about the POW camp, specifically how the guards would smoke cigarettes and then intentionally flick the butts just out of reach of the prisoners inside the fence. He and his buddies devised a tool to reach out through the fence and grab the butts when the guard turned their back. They'd then pass the butt between them to get a tiny puff. He was a very kind, very quiet, very intelligent man who had a very bad drinking problem. Edited. Thanks for all the responses and awards. When my grandmother died, we helped my grandfather move out of his house into an apartment. I had found a mason jar filled with old shiny rocks in his basement. When we looked closer, we realized it was gold teeth, acre kills from the war. That's when I learned my grandfather was a sniper. He served on the Pacific side fighting the Japanese. He died a couple of years ago at the age of 99. Well into his 90s though, he could still shoot a squirrel with a gun and a slingshot from a pretty long distance. He met up with the men in his unit every year after the war until they all died. My grandfather was a trained medic, not frontline, but where they took immediate survivors. The Germans were known, so sabotaged train bridges, and it was standard protocol to stop and inspect them before crossing. Well, his conductor was drunk and not only didn't stop, but was speeding into the bridge when it exploded. My aunt has the pictures, but let's just say the rubble he was found under. Wooden trains don't just derail, they shatter, especially off a bridge, was crazy. He described it to me, and I wanted to cry. He lost many friends. My grandpa was in the Navy and was a rear gunner on a plane. He was still training when the war was finishing up, but the story goes that he was trying to shoot a target on the ground for training. He was adamant on hitting it, so he unbuckled himself to get a better shot. Because of this he got pulled out of the plane and was hanging on only by the rear gun. Eventually he was able to pull himself back into the plane surprisingly. He probably never tried that again. My great grandfather didn't fight in WW2 per se, but he did achieve something pretty significant. He lived in Serbia, and at the end of World War II, and at liberation of Belgrade in 1944, during their retreat, the Nazis had mined every bridge they retreated past, in order to stop the progress of the Soviet Red Army and the People's Liberation Army of Yugoslavia, that were chasing them. They would have got away with it if there was not for my great grandfather, Miladin Zeri, who had considerable experience in demining gained previously during Balkan Wars and First World War. He had seen the Nazis placing the explosives, and during the night, he saved the bridge from demolition by climbing the bridge and single-handedly cutting all the detonator wires, making it the only large bridge in Europe, beside Ludendorff Bridge, that the Germans didn't succeed in demolishing while retreating. The importance of his act is even bigger considering that the next bridge connecting Belgrade and Sirmia was in Sabuk, 90 kilometers away. He was given a medal for it, which I still have in my room, and a memorial of him was erected in Belgrade. I think grandpa saw some shit because he never talked about it, and we later found out that he was lying when he said he never saw action. It's really sad how that generation suffered in silence. Men were taught not to show weakness, and it always makes me sad that soldiers didn't receive the help they needed to cope. There was a bombing and a friend of my grandfather was hiding under the table, but it collapsed on him. leaving him with a brain injury that would give him flashbacks from time to time where he again thought bombers are coming. To not get hit again, he always started to run out of the building he was in. Once he jumped out of the second floor of a building because of it, and that was it for him. My grandfather passed about 15 years ago. When asked what I wanted out of his things, I only wanted his chunk of shrapnel. He told me the story behind it when I was about 12. He was a bombardier in the 57th Bomb Wing in WWII. He flew missions mostly over Italy, dropping 1,000-pound bombs on bridges and fuel storage facilities. He had seen some horrific things and was in horrific situations regularly. If you've seen the film Memphis Belle, you can get an idea. He was on a bomb run and said the flak anti-aircraft fire was so thick you could walk on the black plumes of smoke from the shrapnel expelling flak explosions trying to shoot them down. The plane next to him was blown in two, and he watched them fall in two pieces with screaming airmen live as the plane was falling and burning. Other things he wouldn't talk about. Then he produced this piece of shrapnel from flak fire. He said he kept it because it almost killed him. He was scoping a bombing run target, looking down through his spotting scope, sitting up and checking his map on a board adjacent to the side of the plane where he sat. He looked down, sat up, then looked down again, and the shrapnel blew through the side of the bomber and went right through his map board and stuck in a support beam behind it. It was in direct line through his head. If he was sitting up looking at the map, I wouldn't be here today. If he was looking at the map and not the target, I wanted that shrapnel and it's all I wanted. I have it. I also received his aviator glasses, bomber's jacket and oxygen mask.